Great stuff. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you very much for joining me for this afternoon talk. I hope you're all well in these very unusual times. Today I'm going to be talking to you all about winter birds in Sussex. Now, I'm sure most of you have met me already and have seen perhaps a presentation that I featured in. But my name's James. I'm a Learning and Engagement Officer, and I have been with Sussex Wildlife Trust for the last 3 years now. I've always been a very, very passionate naturalist since childhood. And today, as I said, my chosen subject for you all is winter birds in Sussex. But before we get onto the winter birds, let's tick off a few other things first. And let me pose the question to you, just how many UK bird species do we actually have? Now, if you all have a little think about that, what do you sort of think it might be? And I'm talking, regular sort of breeding species. Well, we have around about 270 sort of species across the UK and Ireland. I would not necessarily say commoner species, but certainly more regular. Now, having said that, how many species have actually been recorded in the UK as a whole? Well, I have to tell you, this number is significantly higher than the 270 odd, and it's actually around about 620 at present. So that obviously means there's this huge dichotomy between, our regular species and the number of recorded species. And I'll get to the reasons for why that is in the next few slides. Now, out of all those species, I just want to talk to you a little bit about how bird populations are kind of classified around the UK. Well, the first group really are our resident bird species. So they're the ones that are sedentary. They tend to stay in the same location all year round. And as a whole, their distributions remain quite sort of, quite static. The second group of birds that are sort of partial migrants. So this is where some might remain resident in some parts of their range, but in other parts of the range, they actually leave their breeding areas to overwinter elsewhere. Now, the third group are our summer breeding visitors. So these are really familiar birds, those like the cuckoo and the swallow, birds that arrive here in the summer to breed, but actually head further south for winter. Now, the fourth group, of course, are our winter visitors. They're the ones we're going to be moving on to in a short while. Those are the birds that typically breed in kind of Arctic latitudes, but they're drawn to our very kind of mild winter weather. Now, the next group are passage migrants. So these are birds that don't actually breed in the UK. It's just the ones that are, they're passing through on their way between breeding areas and wintering areas. And the very last group are the vagrant birds. So the vagrant birds, they're actually the group that that comprise the sort of 350 odd species difference between the 270 and the 620. So these are birds, basically, they're rare visitors that turn up from a wide range of different regions, and often they'll occur seasonally, but they are vagrant visitors. We're not really going to be going into vagrant visitors too much in this presentation. Okay, so is it really that simple, everybody? That is the question I would ask you. Well, in a word, no, it isn't really that simple, unfortunately. And the reason for that is because migration is a very, very complicated topic. Now, migration across the planet, it's always adapting, it's always changing. It occurs on a whole range of different scales and in lots and lots of different forms indeed. So actually, it's quite possible that more than half of the world's 10,000 odd bird species actually migrate in some capacity. Now, the vast majority of birds that do actually migrate, they're usually those that inhabit very kind of seasonal environments. So, of course, those such as the UK. And this, of course, is where food kind of fluctuates the most, most dramatically. If you think of sort of equatorial regions, then, of course, the food source is fairly consistent all year round. Now, as a result of all this, the kind of distribution of birds is always changing. It's very, very rarely static. There's a whole range of ecological factors, things like climate change, of course, which are now making a huge difference in bird migration. So if we go back to the classifying bird populations, I just want to give you a few examples of some of these different groups of birds. Now, if we think of some resident sedentary birds, the honest truth is we don't actually have that many species that are relatively sedentary in the UK. Now, if I was to tell you that birds like the green woodpecker, the marsh tit, and the tawny owl, they're all fairly sedentary species. So these are species that don't actually go far away from their original breeding area. Now, the next groups we're going to look at are summer breeding visitors, but also passage migrants. So some of them stop to breed in the UK, but some of them are just passing through on their way elsewhere. Now, these might be birds like the wheatear. Of course, we do have wheatear breeding here in the UK, but lots of them will go on all the way to Greenland and Alaska, for example. Birds like the spotted flycatcher, this one that's called a wasp just there, and this beautiful redstart. Some of you might be wondering what that redstart's actually caught. That's a four-spotted chaser dragonfly there. Beautiful species. So what about birds that are both resident but also winter non-breeding visitors? Now, these can be some really, really familiar birds. So actually, birds like the starling, for example, are both residents but also winter visitors from the continent. The chaffinch in very much the same capacity, and admittedly a rarer bird as a whole, but the hawfinch also complies to the same sort of migratory rules. So what about birds that are winter visitors but also passage migrants? Well, they might be birds like, for example, the brambling and the turnstone. They both comply to those kind of category types. And then last of all, there are birds that don't comply just to two categories, they comply to three. So these are birds essentially where some might be resident, some might be partial migrants, some might just visit us for the winter, and some might just be passing through as passage migrants. And these can be some pretty familiar birds actually. Birds like the goldcrest, the skylark, the siskin, and the crossbill. So as a result of all that, everybody, what it goes to show is that nearly 2/3 of all of our regular sort of 270 odd bird species actually fall within two or more migration categories. So you can really see that it's not quite as straightforward as you would hope. So now moving on to winter itself. You know, we're very, very lucky in the UK because we draw winter avian visitors from a huge kind of area of the planet. You know, we pull them from this really large longitudinal region that extends all the way from Siberia to Canada. Of course, the UK is warmed by the Gulf Stream, so our climate is very much milder than anywhere kind of on the same latitude in Eurasia. So as a whole, we see more than 140 kind of visiting winter species, and these might, you know, vary from kind of waterfowl, from water birds to waders to gulls and passerines. And what I mean by passerines, passerines are small perching birds, and it's due to the anatomical arrangement of their toes, where they have 3 toes pointing forwards and 1 toe pointing backwards. Now, of all our visitors, easily more than half generally stem from Northern Europe and Russia, usually around 1/4 or more from Iceland, and around 10% from Greenland and Canada. Now, there is a lot of overlap, and what I mean by that is that different bird species, or sorry, the same bird species may come from different regions, so they don't necessarily always come from one spot. So as a whole, you know, we might receive more than 1.5 million waterfowl, more than 4 million waders, more than 2.5 million gulls, and a vast array of seabirds too. And all of these birds arrive to overwinter in and around Britain. Now, of course, that number actually might be dwarfed by the number of passerines, which might exceed more than 20 million. Now, bear in mind, these might not always be that visible. And the reason is that lots of these species are familiar resident species, but it's where their numbers are very, very heavily bolstered in winter by birds from the continent. So these might be species, again, like starling and blackbird and chaffinch, birds that we just assume are sort of here all year round. Now, in winter as a whole, you can really see from this diagram, you know, just how temperate it is in the UK and Western Europe in comparison to Eastern Europe and Scandinavia. And this is very much the reason why lots of the birds choose to congregate here in winter. So we may well see birds in Sussex that arrive from higher areas of the UK, so-called altitudinal migrants. We'll also see a lot of birds that come from Scandinavia, Fennoscandia and Spitsbergen as a whole. Lots of birds that arrive from Iceland, Greenland and the high Arctic. Then, of course, all those birds that arrive from further east, you know, Arctic Russia and Siberia. And then, of course, lots of these birds, as I mentioned, they're just passage migrants, you know, they're just passing through to warmer climates for the winter. Okay, so we go back to this last page very quickly on classifying bird populations. So most of our visitors in winter, what do they comprise? Well, they comprise partial migrants, as I said. They comprise non-breeding winter visitors, and they comprise passage migrants. Now, of course, there are also those vagrants too, but as I said, we're not really going to be dealing with vagrants today. Okay, folks, so now we're going to move on to some winter birds to look out for in Sussex. Now, I should emphasise we're not going to look at all 140 odd species. If we did do that, then I'd probably still be giving this presentation to you in 2022. And I'm sure none of you want to miss your dinner. So we'll just go through a few of sort of key species and spotlight a few individuals. Right, the first birds we're going to look at are some water birds. So conceivably, what water birds might you see in Sussex in winter? And we're going to start off with some of the dabbling ducks. So these are ducks that are not able to dive beneath the surface. They just dabble underneath the surface for their food. Now, the shoveler is certainly a duck species that you may well see. You know, on our wetland reserves like Rye Harbour, Amberley Wildbrooks, for example, and, you know, to an extent in the west of the county, you know, in kind of Chichester Harbour area, these are all real kind of hotspots for overwintering ducks. So the shoveler is a very, very attractive duck. You can see the male here with that broad shovel-like bill. Now, you might also see and hear widgeon. Now, the widgeon is a very, very familiar winter duck species. It also has a really, really diagnostic call. So if you're out and about on a wetland reserve with a lot of water, you will definitely see and hear widgeon. And the call to listen out for is this one, folks, which is a little whistle. There you go, everybody. You can't miss that, can you? A whew, whew. All right. Moving on to the teal. So the teal is a very, very attractive duck. It's got all this beautiful kind of fine barring across the wings and the belly and the chest. It's a very small duck as well, actually. The teal is only around about two-thirds the size of a mallard. So it really is very, very small. Now, it's well worth listening out for their calls as well. The males have these very distinctive quip, quip, quip calls that I'm going to play to you now. There's just a green woodpecker calling in the background there, but listen out for those calls because they're very distinctive. And females have a very different call. It's almost a little bit kind of mallard-like quack quack, but you'll hear it. It's in a sort of descending manner. So keep a listen out for this as well. There you go. So you can hear both the males and the females calling at the same time there. So that's a very, very familiar sound from wetland areas, along with those whistling widgeon. Well, what else might you see? You might see the really beautiful pintail. The pintail is one of my favourite ducks. These are male pintails here, absolutely stunning with those chocolate brown heads. And they also have these really long pin tail feathers, which gives them their name. They're very, very distinctive. Not found in the same kind of numbers as the previous ducks that I've shown you, but very, very beautiful. And the last, oh, no, that's it for dabbling ducks. I'm not going to show you any more dabbling ducks, it turns out. So we're going to move on to some diving ducks, folks. So these, of course, are ducks that are able to fully submerge to capture their food. One to look out for is definitely the pochard. Very, very distinctive in male form here, particularly with that blood red eye. So keep your eyes peeled on inland water bodies for these. And a much rarer duck to look out for is a duck with a name that I absolutely hate. And the reason is that I'm never 100% sure on how to pronounce it. So it could be scorp, it could be scalp, it could be scope. It's all a little bit subjective. And until somebody tells me otherwise, then I could well come up with any one of those three at any given moment. Now, this duck looks remarkably similar to a tufted duck. This is a female in winter plumage, but you're going to have to look at an awful lot of much more common tufted ducks in order to find this bird. Now, I have to say, generally, they don't tend to inhabit sort of inland water bodies quite as often as you will find them around coastal waters, but it's well worth looking closely to see if you can find one. Okay, so now we're going to spotlight one of my favourite diving ducks, a real beauty, and that is the goldeneye. Absolutely stunning. They really are beautiful. And you can very much see why the goldeneye gets its name there. So the goldeneye in Sussex is a fairly scarce winter visitor. We just have a very, very small breeding population of these birds in Scotland. Now, the numbers of goldeneye in Sussex will typically be somewhere in the region of 200, perhaps a little bit less depending on the winter. They tend to arrive here from sort of late autumn onwards, from around about October. Now, interestingly, where the goldeneye do breed, they're actually a tree nesting species, and there's a lot of conservation work going on in Scotland to help protect the habitats that are vital for breeding goldeneye. So golden eye numbers, their wintering numbers have actually declined quite heavily in recent years. And it's very likely that the reason for this might be due to short stopping. And the reason for this short stopping or shorter migration could well be to do with climate change. And this is where these birds, they're not needing to fly so far in winter because the water bodies that they're inhabiting are not freezing over, hence why they're not traveling to the regions that they once were. Okay, folks, so I'm just going to give you a few spotting tips for goldeneye, so you can hopefully try and see one this winter. Now, if you're really lucky, you might witness a courtship display. They actually do this in winter, and it's where the males throw their heads back onto their back, stretching their neck and bill upwards. It's a really, really fantastic thing to see. I don't want to pressurise Michael, but he did actually find me a picture of this for the end of the presentation last time. So if you keep your fingers crossed, then with a bit of luck, you might do that again. Now, the goldeneye is a shy species, so it regularly dives, and you'll find that they often spend as much time above the water as they do below it. Often you find them in these small sort of mixed sex groups where it might just be one or two males and a few females. So you can see here that the female bird is significantly different from the male, much, much less colourful. Now, in flight, the goldeneye's wings actually produce a really distinctive whistling sound, but I have to be honest, it's not something you're going to hear very often, just because we don't tend to see that many goldeneye as a whole. Now, look out for them generally on kind of larger lakes, larger gravel pits around sort of fairly sheltered coastline. Rye Harbour often tends to be quite a good place to find goldeneye in winter. Okay, folks, so now we're going to move on to diving sawbills. Now, what do I mean when I say sawbill? Well, what I mean is that these ducks have very, very small serrations or serrated teeth within their bill to help them to grip onto slippery fish. Now, this sawbill is one that you may well see around coastal waters in winter. It's a red-breasted Meganza. So you've got the male duck at the back there with the greenish head and the female at the front here. Now, you don't tend to find these on inland water bodies quite as much as one of their relatives, which is the beautiful goosander. Absolutely love the goosander. You can see this stunning male up there on the left with that beautiful iridescent green head, and then the female down here on the right. Now, you might all be thinking, how do you tell a female goosander from a female red-breasted Meganza? Well, really, it's to do with that russet coloration on the head, and there's a very distinct separation on the goosander, whereas in the red-breasted Meganza, that russet colour tends to bleed down into the neck. So this is a duck you're more likely to see on inland water bodies, small ponds and lakes, and even on rivers. So keep an eye out for them. Now, I'm going to spotlight my very favourite sawbill duck, an absolute beauty, and this is the Smew. So for any of you who've been lucky enough to see a Smew, you'll appreciate what a stunning bird this is. Now, it is a very, very scarce winter visitor to Sussex. It doesn't breed in the UK or Ireland as a whole. Now, typically we'll see less than 50 Smew each winter, and our birds are most likely to come from kind of North Finland and Western Russia. Now, they are a really hardy species. So this is a bird of the high Arctic, and they only really move on if the water bodies they inhabit start to freeze over. So generally we see them quite late on. They tend to typically turn up in January, February, and it's very much due to the kind of harshness of the weather on their breeding grounds. We really are at the extreme end of their range as well. So a few spotting tips for you folks to try and find some Smew. Well, they tend to arrive either singly or in very small groups. It's not a particularly social duck species. They're really, really shy. So what I would say is if you do see a Smew from a distance, be very, very careful how you approach it, because they really will take to flight a lot more easily than other ducks. Now, the females are very distinctive, but nowhere near as attractive as the males. So the males, they're kind of colloquially known as white nuns, quite appropriate, and the females in much the same manner are known as redheads. Now, you will tend to spot them on sort of smaller pools and smaller water bodies, and they're able to take off in the manner of some other small ducks in a very, very confined space. Now, generally, they will kind of feed in these shallower waters and smaller pools, and they tend to stay quite close to the kind of margins of the pools, close to the reed beds for safety. Again, they don't tend to socialise with other duck species, but bear in mind, if they're on a pool with other duck species, then you might technically think of that as socialising, but generally you often find them on pools on their own. Okay, so we're going to move on to some swans and geese now, folks. And alongside our familiar mute swans, well, what swans might you see in Sussex? Well, if you're very lucky, you might see a Buick swan. Now, the Buick swan actually breeds further north than any other swan species. It truly is a bird of the high Arctic. Now, most of our Buick swans will have come from sort of Siberia, and they're not particularly common across Sussex in winter. You're probably most likely to see one in the Ada or the Arun Valley. Now, the Buick swan does have a very, very similar relative known as the Hooper swan. And the main difference between these two birds is the extent of the yellow on their beak. So whereas the Buick swan has this kind of circular-ish patch of yellow, the Hooper swan, the yellow is sort of extended into a triangular point. So it actually follows the same kind of pattern as the bill itself. But certainly look out for either of these birds. Now, you might also see the white-fronted goose. The white-fronted goose tends to be more prevalent in the east of Sussex, certainly around Rye Harbour, Scotney Court, Pett Level, for example. It's a very, very diagnostic goose. It's a bit smaller than our sort of resident greylags. It's got this extensive patch of white just behind the bill. And actually, I used to survey these birds about 5 years ago when I had a role on a little Hebridean island. And it's actually very easy to age these geese because the adults have these very distinctive ragged black bands across their belly, whereas the juveniles don't. So it's quite easy to tell the difference between the two. Now, they have a really high-pitched sort of honk, these geese. It's a bit sort of squeaky gait, actually. So I'm just going to play it for you now. Hopefully the sound wasn't too loud there, folks. Otherwise, I might have deafened a few of you there, I think. Okay, so the next goose we're going to move on to is the Barnacle Goose. So keep your eyes peeled for this goose, sometimes for individuals that may be amongst more familiar Canada geese, and sometimes in whole flocks. Now, what I would say about the Barnacle Goose is it's quite likely that we have quite a few feral populations of this goose now. So that is, you know, feral flocks essentially that potentially have escaped from wildfowl collections and actually become wild. And certainly there's quite a large flock of these birds over in Scotney Court in the east of the county, which is very likely to be a feral population. Now, these are a bird that breeds in the high Arctic and they breed high on the cliffs. And it's quite incredible because the young actually have to leave the nest by jumping off the cliffs. These tiny little young, they have no flying ability at all. They're just fluffy little goslings, essentially. And of course, not all of them will survive that. They're often sort of predated by Arctic fox and what have you. But lots of them, of course, do survive. But it's what an incredible spectacle, an incredible spectacle. So keep your eyes peeled for these. They have quite a unique call for a goose. It's actually sounds very similar to a small yapping dog. So have a listen to that here. Okay, everybody, so we're going to do another species spotlight now on another goose species, and this goose is the Brent Goose. So the Brent Goose is actually quite a common visitor across Sussex. It doesn't breed in the UK or Ireland, but will typically have around about 10,000 or so Brent geese here in winter. Now, this bird truly does have a circumpolar distribution across the high Arctic. It's a real long-haul migrant as well. So birds will arrive from multiple populations across the planet. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more on the next page. So generally they'll start arriving from sort of mid-autumn. And as I said, you know, they come from different areas. So actually you may well see 3 different races of Brent goose in the UK. Now there's the pale-bellied Brent goose, which typically stems from Greenland and Arctic Canada. There's the black Brent, the black Brant, which typically comes from North America. And by far and away the commonest in Sussex is the dark-bellied Brent goose. And this is the one you're most likely to see. Now, what I would say, the most distinct thing about the Brent goose is it's a really, really small goose. So actually this bird is only around about the size of a mallard. So it's really tiny for a goose. Now, in winter, look out for them grazing around sort of coastal grassland, estuaries and upon mudflats. So generally they'll be looking to eat eelgrass, algae and sort of cereals if it's, you know, the edge of agricultural land. Now, generally, you will find them in flocks. They may not necessarily be huge flocks. They can just be tens of birds or even less. And these flocks generally will include, families, non-breeding pairs, and of course, individuals as well. So this bird is a regular swimmer. So sometimes you will actually see them in sort of shallow coastal waters, just sort of lounging around near the shore. So keep your eyes peeled for that as well. Okay, we're going to move on to Greebs and Divers now, folks. So in winter, you may be lucky enough to see the little Slavonian Grebe. Now, I have to tell you, I'm sorry to say, but the Slavonian Grebe in summer plumage is a phenomenal looking thing. It's absolutely incredible. But in Sussex, you're only really going to see this bird in winter plumage, and that's if you're very lucky. So this is a bird actually that just breeds really in the sort of far north of Scotland, but not really much further south. You'll typically see them, on inland water bodies, smaller and larger pools, sort of shallow estuaries, and sometimes shallow coastal waters. In much the same manner to its relative, the black-necked grebe. And you might be thinking, wow, they're pretty similar. How on earth am I going to tell the difference between a black-necked grebe and a Slavonian grebe? Well, I'm not going to go into that today, but the posture of the birds, the shape of the head, all these bits and pieces add up to making birds that are quite different. But in much the same manner, the black-necked grebe is also much more fantastic in its breeding plumage. But again, you're only going to see here in winter plumage. So you might also be lucky enough to see a red-necked grebe. Now, I have cheated here a little bit, and I've actually shown you a bird in summer plumage. Now, much like the other two, unfortunately, this again is a much drabber bird in winter. Now, when I was putting together this presentation, I actually dug out perhaps my oldest bird book, and I found a little record actually of a pair of red-necked grebe that I saw back at Dungeness in 1995. Now, of course, that was something I'd completely forgotten about, so that was a nice little memory jog for me. Okay, what about divers? Well, actually, if you look out in shallow coastal waters, particularly around sort of shallow sandy bays, you might see a red-throated diver. Now, once again, I'm going to have to apologise, everybody, because you're not really going to see a red-throated diver in breeding plumage. This is a bird that breeds up in, in lochs and bogs, kind of in the far north of Scotland, not down here in Sussex, unfortunately. But if you're doing a bit of sea watching, then keep your eyes peeled for this bird. Now, this is what you're more likely to see, which is going to be the red-throated diver in winter plumage. I'm just going to play you a little bit of their call as well, because they've got a really fascinating kind of mournful call. Superb thing. And actually, part of the reason why I wanted to play that to you folks was because it gives a very slight hint towards one of my all-time favourite bird calls, which is that of the Great Northern Diver. Now, I'm not going to spoil it for you today and play you a Great Northern Diver, because I want you all to go away and find a Great Northern Diver call, because it is absolutely phenomenal. It sounds otherworldly, and you can only assume that in days gone by, when people were living in the wild all the time, hearing Great Northern Divers ringing out across the landscape must have been absolutely phenomenal, but quite eerie at the same time. So yeah, go out and find yourself a Great Northern Diver call. Okay, so now we're going to move on to some wading birds, and we're going to start off with some of the larger wading birds. What might you see? Well, one of the first that you might see is the golden plover. So the golden plover is a very familiar bird of sort of late autumn and winter down here in Sussex. Now, it's very much a flocking bird. You'll tend to see them in large numbers, and they're often in combination with lapwings as well. You often see the two flocks mixing. Now, for example, the east of the county, Rye Harbour, again, is a great place to see hundreds and hundreds of golden plover in winter. Now, here's a little shot of some in flight, and I just want to point you to those birds that have got their wings open, and you can see where they have white armpits or underwing coverts. And the reason that's quite relevant is because they're markedly different from the golden plover's relative, the grey plover. Now, the grey plover might look quite similar, but actually it has black armpits, black underwing coverts in comparison. Now, the grey plover, you don't tend to see them together in such huge numbers, although occasionally you do get largish sort of roosts of them on the beach, but they're quite a similar looking bird. Both of these birds in summer plumage are vastly more exotic, in line with most of our wading bird species. Okay, well, you might see one of our two Godwit species, which are the black-tailed Godwit and the bar-tailed Godwit. Now, we do have some black-tailed Godwit breeding in the UK, but the bar-tailed Godwit doesn't breed here. Now, I know what you're all thinking. It'll be easy to tell the difference if you look at the colour of their tail. Well, unfortunately, the one piece of advice I could give you about Godwits is don't try and use their tail to identify them. Now, you might be looking at this bar-tailed Godwit on the right and saying, well, that one's got a black tail, but actually it's an illusion. Those black feathers are actually the extent of the primary wing feathers. They're not the tail, and the small barred tail is actually nestled just below those black wing feathers. Now you can see the black-tailed Godwit in winter plumage has a more uniform sort of back. You know, it's not particularly sort of scalloped or very nicely patterned. So you can see the bar-tailed Godwit in winter has much nicer patterning, which makes it quite easy to identify. Now you might also see a ruff. The ruff is quite a familiar passage migrant. It's not really a breeding species in the UK anymore. It became kind of largely extinct about 150 odd years ago. The ruff in spring is absolutely fantastic. The males have this beautiful feathered ruff around their necks, which may be white, it may be black, it may be ginger. They're absolutely superb. But if you see a ruff in winter, you know, we have a small overwintering population. This is what it's going to look like. So it's sort of similar in look to a redshank, but with a shorter beak, slightly curved beak, and very long-legged as well. Now, of course, you might also see one of our very familiar Sussex winter residents, which is the curlew. Now, the curlew actually breeds typically in the northern uplands of northern England and Scotland. But in winter, we can get surprisingly large curlew roosts down here in Sussex. In fact, I was looking at a flock of around about 120 curlew at pet level just last week when I walked there on my daily exercise, I should add. I'm just going to play you some curlew calls as well now. Very, very familiar. It's an onomatopoeically named bird, which you'll see very shortly. So that's the very familiar curly call, curly, curly. And they do also have a sort of bubbling trill as well to listen out for. Beautiful birds. Okay, so we're just going to look at a few small waders quickly. What small waders might you see? Well, you might see the knot. And I guess the most distinguishing thing about the knot in winter plumage is it doesn't really have many distinguishing features, everybody. It's a bit of a bland looking bird. In summer, as I mentioned, with a lot of wading birds, it has this beautiful brick red plumage. It's really, really attractive. Now, the knot, however, is the wading bird species that's associated with huge overwintering flocks, particularly in sort of East Anglia in winter. So sometimes these flocks of knot can be sort of 10,000 strong, and they make for an absolutely superb spectacle. We don't tend to see them down in Sussex in those kind of numbers, but a bird worth looking out for nonetheless. Now, you might also see a Dundin. The Dundin in summer plumage is unmistakable. It has this big black belly patch. However, the Dundin in winter, unfortunately, it loses this and it becomes a somewhat more, I don't want to use the word dull, but it's not quite as vibrant as it was in summer, suffice to say. Now, it's thought that we probably in the southeast of England receive more overwintering Dundins than any other part of the country. So if you see a bird that's sort of less than 20 odd centimetres, a very small wader scuttling around, then in largish numbers, then realistically they're going to be Dundin. Now, if you're down on the beach, then look out for this little bird, the sanderling. This is a really, really characterful little wader. And what it does is it charges around on the shoreline following the receding tide. It's really, really active. It never stops. They're really, really fun to watch. So if you do happen to be doing your daily exercise down on a sandy beach, then look out for these birds. Now, you might also see a green sandpiper. Like the sanderling, the green sandpiper doesn't actually breed in the UK. So this is a bird that we either see on passage migration or we have a sort of small overwintering population of green sandpiper. Now, interestingly, on their breeding areas, they actually nest in trees. But in winter, you can find green sandpiper almost anywhere. It's really not very fussy. And you'll find them in sort of ditches and around small rivers and, you know, on mud flats and just all sorts of places and around sewage works. I mean, I'm not suggesting you all go to a sewage works, obviously. It's not the dream location. But having said that, they are very productive for wading birds. So you might want to bear that in mind. Okay, folks, so we're just going to do a couple of wader species in the species spotlight. And the first one we're going to look at is the turnstone. So the turnstone is a fairly common winter visitor. Doesn't normally breed here in the UK or Ireland, but we do actually have quite a lot of them here in Sussex, usually around about 1,000 birds over winter. Now they breed all around the Arctic, really, really widely distributed. We see them both as a passage migrant, but also a winter arrival. So the passage migrants tend to arrive here in late summer, but those that are going to stay the winter tend to arrive a little bit later. Now they're a really, really adaptable bird. And actually there's quite a few places around the UK where you'll just see turnstones running around on the promenade. You can get really, really close to them. It's quite surprising. Now, a few spotting tips for them. Well, look out for them in small groups. They're a very, very social bird, pardon me, and they do live up to their name, you know, turning stones, looking out for small invertebrates to feed on. Now, they're really, really active. They never stop looking for crabs and mollusks and other things to eat. As I said, they're very confiding. You can often get really, really close to them. Generally, they tend to avoid sort of sandier beaches, but if the beach is fairly sort of rocky, has a lot of rock pools, for example, then generally you will find turnstones there. Now, they also have really, really distinctive patterns on their back and wings. So they have all these white bars. So actually, if you do happen to flush a turnstone flock, you'll see them typically flying out low over the water. And if you look out for all these white bars, they're unmistakable because none of our other wading birds have quite so much white evident on the wings in flight. Now, we're also going to look at another species that you may well find with the turnstone. And this is the rather, I think they're quite adorable, to be honest. I know we shouldn't anthropomorphize, but I love a purple sandpiper. They're a great little bird. The one thing I would say about them is they're not very purple, to be honest with you. They're just a tiny little bit purple, but not very purple. So they are quite a scarce winter visitor to Sussex. There are very small numbers of them that breed in Scotland, but generally there'll be sort of less than 100 birds in Sussex in winter. Now, we really are right at the extreme sort of southwest of the purple sandpiper's range. This is a bird that actually is breeding amongst the Arctic tundra. Generally, they arrive from sort of autumn time onwards, and it's usually the juveniles that will arrive with us first. So what about a few spotting tips for the purple sandpiper? Well, to be honest, everybody, although we don't have that many purple sandpiper, they're really reliable. They tend to be really site faithful. So often you will find they return to the same areas year on year. Now, you do often find them in association with turnstones, as I mentioned, and they're quite a dumpy little bird because they've got really, really short legs. So they're quite funny to watch. So look out for them sort of scuttling along. It's really distinctive. And unlike some of our other waders that you might see on the beach, you might see within estuaries, this is a bird that you're going to see on structure. You know, you're going to see them on piers, you're going to see them on jetties, you're going to see them scuttling around amongst seaweed covered rocks. Now, like the turnstone, they can be really tame, allowing you for quite a close approach. And often you'll find them foraging very close to the water's edge, particularly if they're feeding amongst rocks. And you'll see them sort of jumping up and fluttering to avoid being sort of, well, to avoid being submerged, essentially. Sometimes they will also swim as well, actually, I should mention. So generally, if you do disturb them, they'll fly a short distance and they'll land in much the same area, just a short distance away. So generally, you can get quite close to them. Okay, everybody, so we're going to move on to a few birds of prey now. And alongside our more familiar winter birds of prey, or our more familiar species as a whole, like the kestrel and the buzzard, you know, in winter you might see birds like marsh harrier, certainly over, you know, reserves like Rye Harbour and Amberley Wildbrooks once again. But some other more unusual raptors to look out for are the Scandinavian, the Arctic buzzard, the rough-legged buzzard. Now, I haven't got time to go into all the identification features between rough-legged buzzard and common buzzard, but what I will say is if you see any particularly pale buzzards at this time of the year, it's really worth having a close look, and if you can, get a photo. Now, the common buzzard does come in 3 different colour morphs, or a variation of those, and one of them is very, very pale. So don't assume that every pale buzzard is a rough-legged buzzard. But if you can get a good look at it, try and remember as much detail as you possibly can. Lovely bird. So this is a bird that is typically, breeding in the Arctic and up in Scandinavia. Now, in winter, in Sussex, well, you actually have to rely on winter to see a merlin down here, because the merlin is a falcon that breeds in the uplands of the UK, particularly up in sort of, up in Scotland, on moorland. Now, it's a very, very small falcon. This is a bird that's only very, very slightly bigger than a missel thrush, but it's a really powerful little predator, really, really agile. Now, the chances are, if you see a merlin at this time of the year, you might see it because it's flushed a small flock of passerine birds, something like meadow pipit, and they may well have flushed because they've been disturbed by a merlin. So look out for these sort of aerial pursuits that happen just feet above the ground. They can be really, really dramatic. So we're just going to spotlight a couple of raptor species now. And one to look out for in winter down here is the hen harrier, the magnificent hen harrier. Now, the hen harrier is really, really scarce in Sussex in winter. Typically, there's usually less than around 50 birds, but it's very, very hard to estimate. And the reason for that is they're a very nomadic species. Now, I'm not going to go into it too much in this presentation because it really is a whole presentation in itself. But the hen harrier, unfortunately, is now one of the UK's very rarest birds of prey. There's a number of reasons for that, but unfortunately one of those is persecution, and particularly on the grouse moors. They have an awful part to play in the persecution of the hen harrier. Now, the hen harrier is a partial migrant, so some of our breeding birds will move further south, but we also receive birds that come from Northern Europe. Now, as I said, it is declining owing to that kind of level of persecution, but also loss of suitable habitat. So what about a few spotting tips for hen harrier folks? Well, how do you spot a hen harrier? Well, of course, those pale grey males are simply unmistakable. Just like Michael's drawing at the beginning of this presentation, some of you may remember it was absolutely perfect. Beautiful pale grey male, spot on. The females, however, are slightly different. So they're a mottled brown and they're known as ringtails, and they have this very distinctive white rump. In fact, both sexes have that white rump, so really something to look out for. Now, you should look out for them at this time of the year on coastal marshland, around farmland and along river valleys. That's really the kind of prime areas for them. But they are very nomadic. They move around a lot, and this is what makes the numbers very, very hard to estimate here. So if you are really lucky, perhaps you'll actually see birds heading to a communal roost amongst reed beds and on heathland, and that really would be superb if you manage to see that. So during the day, they tend to hunt singly, and in a very typical harrier style, they hold those wings in a shallow V. So that is something to look out for when they're hunting. Now, I have to say, most of the daytime sightings in Sussex in winter are generally concentrated around the South Downs, particularly in the kind of lowland river valleys. So if you happen to be doing your daily exercise in areas like that, then really do keep your eyes peeled for hen harrier. Now, we're also just going to take a quick look at short-eared owl. Beautiful owl species, fairly scarce winter visitor. They do breed in northern England and Scotland. I will say very briefly, when I did work up on the Hebrides, I was very lucky that I used to see this species almost every single day. And part of the reason for that was, of course, they're resident up there, and lots of them stay there all year round. Now, in Sussex, by contrast, we typically get less than around 50 short-eared owls every year. And they do disperse very, very widely. So you never really know where they're going to turn up. Now, they are a passage migrant. So, their nomadism means that the populations around the country really do fluctuate year on year. And that also is really dependent on the availability of prey. They spend an awful lot of time feeding on species like short-tailed field vole. And these vole species are cyclical, they come in peaks and troughs. And for that reason, the short-eared owl distribution is very much tied in with that. So generally, we see them in Sussex from around about September onwards. And what about a few spotting tips for you? Well, they're a very, very diagnostic owl species. They've got these piercing yellow eyes and a lovely dark facial mask. Now, they're partly diurnal, and that means they're partly day hunters. So essentially, look out for a bird that has a fairly relaxed sort of flying style. And often what they'll do is they'll cartwheel, almost somersault down onto their prey within the sort of rough grassland. Oh, I've kind of answered my own next point. There you go. Look out for them hunting over rough grassland. Also coastal marshes. So coastal salt marsh is a great place to find short-eared owl in winter. Generally, they are solitary, but you might see them hunting in conjunction with barn owl. Certainly, if the vole populations are very high. And as I say, you know, keep your eyes peeled for them perch. So this is a species that will regularly perch, particularly on posts. That's always a good place to kind of have a little look with your binoculars. They will generally perch on the ground as well. That is not unusual at all. And part of the reason for that is this is a species that typically roosts on the ground. So as opposed to the long-eared owl, which will always roost in trees, although short-eared owls will sometimes do that, the majority of the time they're going to be roosting on the ground. Okay, folks, so the last section we're going to do is the passerines, the small perching birds. So remember, these are the birds with those 3 forward-facing toes and the 1 toe backwards. Well, some passerines you're almost definitely going to see are the redwing. So we might have up to around about 1 million redwings sort of invading the UK in winter to feast on all our berries. Now, the redwing migrates at night, and one of the key things to listen out for actually is the redwing's flight call. So if you go out in late autumn, even if you live in an urban area, keep your ears peeled for this call because it's really, really diagnostic. It's a sort of high-pitched sp, sp. So I'm going to play it for you now, everybody. So keep your ears peeled for this. So there you go. That was the redwing's high-pitched flight call. And now I'm going to play you another call. Often when they're feeding, you know, they're feeding in the trees, sometimes high in the canopy, sometimes in the hedgerows. You might hear a more nasal note before that high-pitched call. So listen out for that here. I'm going to play it. It's a very quick call, this one. There you go. That was it. So it was a squeaky little gack note before that high-pitched flight call. So listen out for that because this is quite a shy bird and they will generally fly off when you get too close to them. Now, you also should look out for its cousin, other windrush species, the fieldfare. So the fieldfare is a very, very handsome bird. They have also arrived here to feast on berries, to feast on all the kind of fruit fall in late winter. Now, these have markedly different calls. They've got a chattering call that sounds very similar to a camera shutter. So I'm just going to play that here for you. And you may also have heard that sort of squeaking, shivering note as well, which is a very typical call on migration. So I'm just going to play you a little bit more of those kind of camera shutter-like calls. Like 1,000 camera shutters all going off at one time, isn't it? Okay, so I'm going to do a species spotlight, everybody, now. And we're going to spotlight the beautiful waxwing. Who doesn't love a waxwing? Absolutely superb. So the waxwing is an eruptive winter visitor to Sussex. It doesn't breed in the UK or Ireland. I should say it's an eruptive visitor to the whole of the UK, actually. So some winters we may have no waxwings at all. In fact, that's usually quite likely. But some we might have a couple of thousand. So there really is substantial variation. Now, this is a bird that breeds in the upland boreal forests of northern latitudes, particularly in Scandinavia. Their arrival is very unpredictable. They're very, very nomadic. And their arrival here really depends on the failure of the berry crop on their breeding grounds. Now, in most years, you know, a few birds do make it as far as Sussex, but unfortunately, there's no guarantee. So how do we go about spotting a waxwing? It always makes me giggle when I see that photo on the right, because that crest is just absolutely phenomenal looking bird. So the waxwing is very gregarious. It's a social bird that generally you will also always see in flocks. Now, it's always worth looking out for them in the upper branches of trees because that tends to be where they congregate. And often they're quite approachable. And the reason for that is because on their breeding grounds, it's very likely that they never see any people. And for that reason, they don't really fear people in the same manner as a lot of other birds. Now, they're very acrobatic. Often you will see them hanging upside down when they're feeding. And they have very kind of short wings and a short tail. And it makes them very similar to a starling. And I know you're all thinking, God, there's no way that bird could ever be confused for a starling. But if you see them at a distance in flight and the light is very poor, there's no colour, then actually the flight profile is almost identical to starling. It's quite surprising. They're also round about the same size, although they do look slightly larger. Now they have very distinctive sort of rattling calls, and I always think they sound a little bit like a tiny little bell being rang. So I'm just going to play that for you now. So that call actually might be the one that alerts you to the presence of waxwing in the first place. Now, where do you see waxwing? Well, honestly, everybody, you can see them wherever there has been amenity planting of fruiting berry trees. And this means that some of the very best places to find waxwing, unbelievably, are in supermarket car parks and industrial estates. So who would have thought that you would see such an exotic bird in such a bizarre location? In fact, they even have I can't think how to describe it. They're even known as the supermarket bird for that very reason. Okay, so what other passerines might you see? Well, you might see the siskin. So the siskin actually is a resident breeding bird across Britain, but in winter we see large influxes of siskin from the continent. And in fact, from late autumn onwards, you may well hear this call with monotonous regularity. Not monotonous, I mean, that's a bit harsh, isn't it? But you might hear it regularly, particularly around coastal areas. And this is because siskins are arriving on UK shores from the continent. So I'm just going to play you this slightly kind of twanging call. So there you go, that's the siskin's call. And they do have a slightly up-slurred call and also a slightly down-slurred call. Now, if you're really lucky in winter, you might well see a twite. Now, some of you might be thinking, what on earth's a twite? I've never even heard of one. Well, a twite essentially is, it's like an upland linnet. So while you might see kind of flocks of linnet in winter in Sussex, the twite is a much rarer bird. And that's because it's a breeding bird up in Scotland. Now, you can see from this picture, the twite actually has a very diagnostic red rump. Unfortunately, most of the time the wings are held in a position that doesn't make the rump visible. Now, the one thing I would say is that the twite actually has a small yellowish bill in winter, whereas the linnet has a grey bill, and that's quite a good way to split the two. So their calls are a bit more nasally than the linnet. I'm just going to play some of those to you now. They almost have a rather sparrow-like quality to them, I always think. Okay, so we're just going to spotlight a couple of passerine species, and the first one is the Brambling. Lovely looking bird, the Brambling. So the Brambling's a fairly common winter visitor to Sussex, but it is a very, very rare breeding species here. Now, we may well have more than 200 Brambling in the winter, but this number can vary massively. It can be very little, it can be a few hundred, it can be a couple of thousand. It really, really does depend on the winter conditions. Now, like the waxwing, this is a bird that breeds in the boreal woodlands of the northern Palearctic, but it is very unpredictable. As I said, they try and stay as far northeast in Europe as possible, and their sort of distribution and their movements are very much dependent on the availability of beech mast. So if there's snow on the ground and the beech mast isn't available, then generally they'll move on. So what to look out for with Brambling? Well, it's known typically as the northern chaffinch. It's really gregarious and it's often mixed in flocks along with the chaffinch. So as I said, check those flocks very carefully. The Bramblings are quite distinctive, but generally when you see them in winter plumage, they're not quite as striking, so they can blend in with the chaffinches a little bit better. Now, as I said, look out for them where there's abundant beech mast, and they will feed on the ground in much the same manner as the chaffinch. They often tend to be found around feeding stations, particularly in country parks and such like. So look out for them feeding in farmland, in stubble fields, anywhere essentially where seed is plentiful. And listen out also for these very distinctive sort of wheezing calls that they have. I'm just going to play one of those for you now. And And often those calls will be uttered both when they're perched and in flight. Very, very distinctive. So I have to say, this is a bird that generally is less likely to be seen in your garden. So unless you have a particularly large garden fringing the right kind of habitat, you're probably less likely to see a brambling. One more species spotlight, folks. Another little finch species, the tiny little lesser redpoll. Now, the lesser redpoll is a fairly common winter visitor. Ironically, we also have another redpoll species called the common redpoll, but the common redpoll is not as common as the lesser redpoll, just to sort of confuse things a little bit. So the lesser redpoll generally breeds as a whole in northern England, Scotland and Ireland. The numbers in Sussex, you know, they vary an awful lot. Again, it has quite an eruptive nature. They do breed in Sussex, and it's generally across the high weald that this takes place. As a whole, you know, they're commoner as a passage migrant passing through than a breeding species. And one of the reasons for that, you know, they've seen a really big population crash in the last 50 odd years. And part of that might be due to the loss of sort of pioneer birch woodland as more sort of successional woodland species have taken over. So what about spotting tips for lesser redpoll? Well, it's a very small bird. It's actually just the size of a blue tit. So it's really, really tiny. It's very acrobatic. So like other tit species, it will often hang upside down at the tops of trees. And often you'll find them sort of feeding together in sort of small flocks. Now, I have to say they're often mixed in with siskins. So where you tend to find siskins, you tend to find lesser redpolls. So it's well worth looking amongst these kind of small flocks and seeing what you can see. Now, they have this really distinctive twittering flight call that's often uttered in sort of in three notes at a time. So I'm just going to play that for you now. Have a listen out. So it's a really ringing call, that one. And what was perhaps quite funny was I said that they're usually in sequences of 3, and the majority of calls in that sequence were in sequences of 2 and a few 4s as well. So clearly it's not always in 3s, but they're very, very distinctive nonetheless. Okay, so yeah, look out for them amongst their favoured trees, you know, particularly amongst sort of birch and alder, but also amongst conifers as well, which is very much the same environment you find siskins. The Ashdown Forest, by the way, is a really, really good place to look out for lesser redpoll. So just a couple more birds. Well, what about our warbler species? Well, of the 14 warbler species that breed in the UK, it's very likely, other than the Chetty's warbler, you're only really likely to see 2 other warbler species. One of them might be the chiffchaff, because we do have quite a lot of overwintering chiffchaffs now. Now, although most chiffchaffs actually head down sub-Sahara for winter, quite a few of ours choose to stay, but they're probably not our own breeding birds. It's very likely that these are Scandinavian or European chiffchaffs that have chosen to overwinter in Britain. Now, you might also see another warbler species in winter, which is the blackcap. In fact, many of you might even receive blackcaps to your garden feeders in winter. And part of the reason for this is it seems to be there's a German population, a German breeding population of blackcap that now overwinters in the UK. Of course, this is a huge benefit for these birds because they arrive back on their breeding grounds much more quickly than those birds that are flying all the way to Africa. So keep your eyes peeled for them in winter too. And the very last bird I'm going to cover, everybody, is the beautiful snow bunting. I absolutely love the snow bunting. It's a really, really scarce winter visitor to Sussex. Just a few birds breed up there in the Scottish Highlands. Typically, we have less than about sort of 60 over winter here in Sussex, but again, it's quite hard to estimate. And it has this fantastic claim as being the world's most northerly breeding songbird. Again, they're very, very nomadic. They don't tend to show sort of faithfulness, you know, to sight year on year. And most of our birds are thought to come from kind of Iceland, Greenland, and the Faroe Islands. And I also found in that bird book, where I found the red-necked grebe, the snow bunting was perhaps the very first unusual bird that I'd ever made a note of back in 1993 on Shoreham Beach. Well, it was certainly the first that I ever wrote down anyway, that's for sure. I do have vague memories of a red-necked phalarope turning up, but I can't remember whether that was before or after the snow bunting. So A few spotting tips for the Snow Bunting. Well, it's a really beautiful bird and you want to look out for it along the seashore and around sort of coastal pasture. It's really active and restless, but generally you can get quite close to it. And in much the same manner as with the waxwing, it's relatively unfazed by people. And I think the reason for that is they obviously don't see people up on their breeding grounds. I can distinctly remember that bird that I saw on Shoreham Beach. I was able to get to about 5 meters and it was completely unfussed by my presence. So that was why it was so memorable. Now, they have this kind of really noticeable shuffling motion as well. Their legs are really short and hardly visible, so they almost look like they're shuffling along on their bellies. Look out for them on the strand line. This is often where they're feeding. And what I would say is that their coloration as a whole, they do look a little bit more subdued in winter. You've probably all noticed there's a bit of a theme with all the winter birds I've shown you, and that's the fact that they all look a bit more subdued than they do in their breeding plumage, but a beautiful bird nonetheless. Now, I've probably overrun a little bit, folks, but that is everything. That's all complete now. So thank you very much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it. Apologies that I've gone on for quite so long. It feels like I've been talking for hours. I don't know whether that's actually the case. Is that
it's about 4 hours, James? That was. Thank you for
about
that.
4 hours. Yes, yeah. It did feel about 4 hours actually. So
that was fantastic. Thank you. Thank you very much for that, James. Yeah, certainly an epic talk there. Let me just try to wiggle my camera around. It's sort of the Ben Hur of bird talks. I think it was a real epic. So
indeed.
So thank you for that. Now there's been a few questions. What we'll do if you stop sharing your screen, James, if you do that, and if I share mine, I think, let's see if this works a minute. There we are. Look.
There you go.
There we are. I do this, and then I can hopefully I can move it along. Now I have some questions, and the first. Is this working? There we are. The first thing you did ask for was GoldenEye footage. So I've been hard at work behind the scenes. So James mentioned that the GoldenEye display, and there we are. So it's not working again. Look. What's wrong with my screen here? 1 second. There we are. Look. James saw the incredible courtship display of the GoldenEye. So there he started off, James, and there he goes.
Look at that.
All over. There we are. So
yeah.
Okay. Well, we've got time to have just a few questions. Not quite a few questions along the way. I guess the first thing we need to say is it's a fantastic talk and hopefully very inspiring. But unfortunately, we can't all get out at the moment and go walking around all over Sussex. I mean, James is very lucky. He lives down near Rye Harbour over there, so he may see a few of these. But just to remind people at the moment, if we just try and stay local for the moment, and you never know, you may see one of these waxwings in your local area if you're very lucky. But certainly on my daily walks around the cul-de-sac here, there's field fares and redwings, and I had a siskin flying over the other day. So there's
superb,
plenty going on. There's a few questions. This one sort of combines one from Aidan, Jill, and Kerry, and they want to know what sort of effect climate change and warmer winters is having on our winter visitors.
Yeah, well, I mean, as I talked about at the beginning of the presentation, migration is such a transient sort of process. It's never static, and inevitably climate change is having a huge effect because it means that certain species choose not to leave their breeding grounds. They might move to different locations. They might not go so far south. They might not go so far north to breed. So, it has such a huge effect. We're already seeing changes in the arrival times of different bird species, in the departure times of different bird species. So it really, it's a process that's in flux. And there is absolutely no doubt that it is changing bird behaviour, no doubt at all.
Okay, now there's one question here. I'm only going to ask it because it's my favourite bird. But where is it? Mark asked, is the water rail a resident or a visitor?
Well, I'll let you talk about the water rail then, Michael. I don't want to deprive you of your favourite.
Well, you go. I'll talk about it. I can do an impression of the call if you want. No, I won't do that.
No,
I won't do that.
Please do.
The pig squealing. I'll save that for another webinar. But yeah, so water rails do breed in Sussex, but like lots of birds, we do get a lot more of them here in the winter when they're pushed over by cold weather from the continent. But certainly, if you're out in the spring, you may hear that sound, a lovely, beautiful sound, like a pig being strangled, and you hear that from the reed beds, maybe at Rye Harbour, or even over at Woods Mill in the centre of the county. But in the winter, you do see them if you're lucky, I guess, down at some of the sort of and Arundel wildfowl wetlands. When that's open, that's a good place to see water rails. If it's frozen, you'll see them being pushed out into the open there. But hopefully, if some of you do have a nice local area on your local exercise, which is near some wetlands, you may see a water rail. But we may have to wait until the restrictions are lifted, until we can all head out and find our own. Well, I guess the last thing I'll point out, James, there's quite a few questions here, but I haven't got time to go through them. But Christoph pointed out the Oxford English Dictionary recommends that scorp rhymes with corp.
Do you know, I'm so pleased to hear that, because I've always had a huge mental block with, I can just never remember which is actually the correct pronunciation. So scorp, okay, scorp. I'm going to try and
rhymes with corp.
Head and bear that in mind for next time. Scorp.
All right.
Scorp. Okay.
Well, thank you, James. We're gonna just move on. Before we finish, I just thought I'd highlight we have a lot more webinars coming up. I've been planning a load more this afternoon as well. So there's plenty going on before the end of the month. This evening we have the Wildlife of Dung with Dr. Sarah Meganza. That should be interesting. I'm looking forward to that. So I shall be back at 7:30 this evening. Also, James is going to return next Tuesday. He did his first part of his Across the Sahara epic last Tuesday. He's back next Tuesday to do the concluding part of his journey across. Was it a Peugeot 306? Wasn't it, James?
It was a 406, Michael, but that's close enough. I'll give that to you.
Well, you know what? That's luckily my bird ID skills are better than my car ID skills.
Exactly. Lots to come in that, by the way. Lots of birds as well.
Brilliant. I did mention actually after the Tuesday session, I was going to talk about my epic journey from Burgess Hill and back to buy a pair of socks in between the two lockdowns. But I actually was joking. People have emailed to say, is that an upcoming webinar? It's not actually. I was joking about that, but it did get quite a bit of interest. So maybe I should talk about my journey to buy some socks.
Why not?
Now, a very popular talk. Now we had to cancel. We got fully booked. We had to cancel the bookings, but now we've actually had to upgrade our Zoom capacity just to accommodate Dr. Barry Yates's A Year at Rye Harbour. So if you haven't booked for Barry's talk, please do, because it was very popular. It's going to be a fantastic review of the year over there at our nature reserve over there in the Far East. Now, a talk on February the 2nd from our ecologist looks at a year in the life of Glenn Norris. Now, James and I have seen this talk already because Glenn gave this to the staff meeting at Christmas, and it's a great overview of our nature reserves and the wildlife and Glenn's job. Yeah, so really looking forward to that in a few weeks. James and I will be back chatting about your sightings on our nature table. And then we have a few new talks I just put in this afternoon, so exclusive, and these are ready to book now. Laurie Jackson's coming back to do her talk on the small mammals of Sussex, which was so popular back in November. I should do that in the afternoon on February the 9th. And then finally, I'm going to bother doing a talk. Because thousands of you haven't asked, I thought I'd do a talk, and I thought I'd do an old talk of mine about the moths of Sussex at the beginning of February. Just to point out, our friends at the SOS, the Sussex Ornithological Society, are also doing some online webinars, and you can book these on our website as well, through our website. But coming up at the end of January is their conference, and certainly the first evening is all about migration, so that's going to fit in well with James's theme today. And the second evening of their conference is another topic that James and I are very passionate about, inclusivity in bird watching. So 2 great evenings there you can watch from the comfort of your own sofa. And also the SOS are doing more talks in February. There's one on autumn bird migration. So again, fitting quite well with James's talk today. Matt Eade there doing a great talk about bird watching in the autumn. So you can book that online as well. So hopefully when I press stop in a minute, so far as this worked, I've been quite pleased with my technological knowledge here, but when I press end in a minute, you should find in your browser the window opens, which have quite a few bits of information you may be interested in. There'll be a link to James's Winter Thrushes talk. Now, it's a fantastic talk about redwings, fieldfares, song thrush, blackbirds, and missel thrush. You can watch the video of that. We've recorded it, and it's available on our catch-up on our website. There'll be a link to that. There'll be a link to some bird websites, and also you can book the upcoming talks as well. And also there'll be a chance to make a donation towards the Wildlife Trust. Or if you're not a member of the Wildlife Trust, we'd love you to have you on board. So perhaps make this year the year that you join up and support our work conserving wildlife across Sussex. Now, if you don't find that page, do go to our normal website and you can scroll down where you see that hare, click on the hare's ears. It'll take you to all that information as well. And I think that's it, James. What's happened here? Well, there we are. So if you enjoyed this afternoon's talk, please do consider making a donation to show your appreciation for James's hard work and his epic Winter Birds talk. There's been over 500 people watching today. So if we all put £2 or £3 in, we make a small fortune, which would be fantastic. So please do consider. And also, of course, if you're not a member, as I say, please consider joining the Wildlife Trust in 2021. So a big thank you again to James. I usually put this little slide up here. And I'm sure if there was 500 people cheering and clapping now, James, it'll be a rapture. People on their feet all across Sussex. You'd probably hear them from over there in Rye. So thank you to James.
My pleasure.
And thank you again for joining us this afternoon. I hope you're all staying safe. And thank you for supporting the Wildlife Trust